The fact of the matter is, GTM tool landscape is very fragmented. A large responsibility of this supposed GTM engineer is to integrate those fragmented tools together to create something that is a little bit more coherent. How you apply certain software engineering concepts becomes really important because that's going to make the difference between, do you have to come back and fix this like next week? Or are you able to easily add on more integrations as your company grows?
If you're building a doghouse, it doesn't matter if you're crappy at carpentry, but if you're building a cathedral, you have to do it right, or otherwise it's just going to keep falling apart. Hey, Joe.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Super excited for this.
Likewise.
Yeah, quick intro for those who don't know Joe. You're going to be glad that you get to watch this, I believe. He's ex-Uber, XYC. He's also Clay Bootcamp student number 2. And he now runs the workflow company. Everyone I talk to seems to always reflexively say Joe's great after I mention him or they mention him. And yeah, he's also doing what I consider to be true GTM engineering. And I'm excited for our conversation about it and other things probably.
Well, thanks for that intro. I appreciate it. I'm happy to be here, talk about quote unquote GTM engineering and a bunch of other stuff. And I'm especially excited because I think you're one of the few people in the space that has run an agency, currently talks to a lot of people who are interested in the space, but also have a sort of a wealth of technical engineering background. And so I obviously learn a lot from you every time I talk to you, and
Likewise.
really excited about geeking out over some technical concepts and going deep into some rabbit holes, which might not do so well with your viewership. I don't know, but I'm
Yeah,
here to talk about what I like to talk about with you, and hopefully you're game for that too.
absolutely. Yeah, I think the benefit of, what I want to show here and otherwise is things that people won't necessarily see on LinkedIn, or they may not have
Hmm.
the attention span to watch on a LinkedIn video or a LinkedIn post, and just help push people's boundaries. So yeah, I'm sure we'll take some interesting paths. And even before we started recording, we had like a whole geek out about all these tools. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
nice. So maybe we can start with tell me about the workflow company and what kind of work you're doing there.
Yeah. So the Workflow Company is a go-to-market AI and automation agency. We're recording right now in January 2025. For all of 2024, we really focused on clay-based programmatic AI enriched outbound that probably a lot of people are familiar with nowadays, right? Clay has really blown up over the course of 2024. You were one of the early ones and set up this boot camp. And having gone through that boot camp, we really focused on that one specific use case. In 2025, we are stepping back a little bit from outbound and we're shifting our focus a little bit more towards more technical, more engineering work around automated CRM enrichment, automated programmatic microsites targeted at specific contacts, automated LinkedIn and social engagement tracking, right? And combining that with signals and triggers to do outreach. The shift in focus happened because, we did a lot of outbound, and what we saw was that oftentimes it tended to be a little bit more tactical than strategic.
Mm.
And you could see a lot of successes doing tactical stuff, right? But without sort of a stronger foundation backing that, sometimes you weren't in full control of your successes, right? And
Hmm.
so what we decided was that we would rather help companies set up sort of the architecture and the system and the foundation for them to more consistently and reliably see success in any sort of GTM motions that they set up versus, hyper focusing on just outbound and more of the tactical nature of that.
Do you feel that that was a financial decision primarily, or like a positioning decision, or was it just hey, this is what I like to do. It makes me happy. I'm making enough money with it.
It was interest and values driven, right? So interest, I like building systems. I like thinking deeper about what the right way of doing things is, right? Versus doing something to get the results this time and worrying about the rest later, right? Like I like to think a little bit longer term, sometimes to my detriment, but like that's just the way I think. So this type of work suits, I think, my interests a lot better. And then from a values perspective, um, I want to be able to work and provide value and be able to guarantee to a certain level the outcome, right? Like I want clients to feel really good about working with us. Increasingly, I've found outbound to be dependent on so many factors that are outside of my control. Deliverability, obviously, being top of mind for a lot of people. The client's offer or product market fit, where they are on that journey, being another big one, right? So there were a lot of factors that I just couldn't guarantee, right? That were not under my control. So yeah, from a values perspective, I wanted to be able to provide a service that I was confident in providing and also knowing that it translates to direct value to the client.
Awesome. Yeah, that does seem aligned with how I've heard you, both from the systems perspective and the just wanting to take the long view. I think, for example, reputation is a big thing that you have, and that you don't want to do wrong by anyone in the space.
That's right. I think so. And I think also what's helpful is I don't necessarily look at what I'm doing at the workflow company in this current iteration to be the be all and end all of my career, for example, right? It's always going to be evolving. Throughout my career, I started out as an army sergeant in the Korean military, did investment banking, co-founded a couple of startups, worked at Uber, worked at a YC company, fractional consulting. So like I've done sort of all, bunch of different stuff. And I think I'm just going to continue doing that because I like sort of pursuing my curiosities and learning things. And like, I just like doing that. That's my career is defined by me sort of following and chasing my curiosities. Right. And so when I think about sort of the longer term, it's more important to me that I do things that are in alignment with my values and my curiosities versus let me try to hop on a hype train and try to make as much money as possible right now.
Yeah.
Like I'm not trying to extract as much financial gain out of what I'm doing right now because I don't think that's in line with how I think about work.
Makes sense.
Like it has to be enjoyable. It has to sort of satiate my curiosity. Yeah, if that makes any sense.
Totally. I see a lot of people, including myself, sometimes having that I call it riding off into the sunset mentality, where you're like, I found this one thing that's going to make me $1 billion, and then I'll ride off in the sunset and sit on a beach and drink some whatever pineapple flavored something, but I think that is like, it's an illusion.
Yeah. And it's like, you're aware of sort of the problem of like premature optimization, right? Like finding the global maximum versus the local maximum, right? I think
For sure. Yeah.
I think Chris Dixon had a really good blog article about this like 10 years ago, where it's like the problem of finding the highest mountain, right? Like you're in a mountain range and there's a bunch of peaks, right? And if you want to prematurely optimize and get to the highest point as possible, then you just climb up the first hill that you get dropped on, right? But if you really truly want to find the highest peak in the range, then what you might actually want to do is like wander around a little bit, go up, and then when you get high enough, look around and see if there's actually a higher peak, and then you actually don't want to climb that sort of local peak, right? You want to come back down and then go up a different one. So all that to say, right, like I think for those people who know that this thing is their calling and they want to spend the rest of their life doing, then do that, right? Like do that because that aligns with like what you're looking for in your values. But I'm just speaking for myself that like I know that I like doing a lot of different things. I like just chasing things that are really interesting to me. So I try to build a business and grow in a way that aligns with sort of how I think about work and like how flexible it can be.
I think that that has a lot of implications for how you've built your company structure and many other things. I think of you as the opposite of lead gen, like the exact opposite of a lead gen bro. I know we've talked about this a little bit in the past. Curious to hear, how do you think differently than a lead gen bro?
I'll start off by saying I think there's a lot of really smart and successful people in the lead generation space, right? Like who might come off as a little bit broy or whatever it is, but they're incredibly smart and really successful. One might categorize them as a lead gen bro or whatever. So there's nothing wrong with being a lead gen bro, is what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
Having said that, I do agree with your assessment that I'm probably not what you would consider lead gen bro. I think people tend to think of lead gen bros as very financially motivated, loud but without substance, and hacky without sort of the overarching strategy behind things, right? Like tactics focus versus strategy, let's say. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Like I said, as we started,
Sorry to put you on the spot with this question again.
if their goal is to make as much money as possible, then they on an individual level are optimizing for that, right? They're being very good at self-promoting on LinkedIn or Twitter or wherever it is. They're really good at maybe towing the line of what's legitimate versus what's potentially ethically questionable or morally questionable to drive results for their clients, for example, let's say, right? Or to make as much money as possible. So I think that's fine if that's what you want to do. I think when I think about this as being one of sort of the stepping stones or like a module that I kind of am collecting, right, to potentially do something that's even bigger and bigger and bigger as time goes on, ultimately what you learn and the people you meet and the brand or the reputation that you build for yourself are going to be really important, right? And I try to remind myself that instant gratification comes with its costs, and it's actually better to always try to think longer term, even if I don't know what that end goal is. I don't know what that looks like, but I know that like there are certain non-negotiables as you build towards that, which is like, yeah, you don't want to put your reputation on risk. You don't want to take on as many clients as possible just to make as much money when you don't feel that you have the bandwidth to take them all, or you don't think that you can do a good job for them. So that's a really long ramble. I don't think I answered your question.
You
but
did.
I just like told you a bunch
Thank
of
you.
stuff about how it's okay to be a lead gen bro, but I don't think I am one.
No, that's great. Thank you, Joe. So, in my opinion, the term GTM engineer is great branding, and it's going to blow up if it's not already blowing up. I think there's still less than 100 people on LinkedIn with that as their title, but it's growing pretty fast. But I think there's going to be a controversy about the term, just like there was back in the day around growth hacker, and probably many other titles. So I think you and I probably have a little bit of a different idea of what a GTM engineer is compared to some people. Does learning Clay make you a GTM engineer? Another controversial one.
Yeah. I'm trying to think about the right way because I feel like it's a bit of a trick question. I will say that learning Clay is probably the best way to get started to becoming technical in your approach to architecting GTM motions, right? Or testing rapid experimentation. Maybe the better question is like, what is a GTM engineer, right? Because I think there's a lot of controversy around what it is. And I think a lot of people, myself included, this is funny. I was talking to Claude about this AI, Anthropic. Claude used this phrase that I've never seen before. And I was like, this is exactly what I was talking about, which was experiential myopia, right? And so experiential meaning it's based on your experiences, and myopia meaning it's nearsighted and you're not necessarily looking further ahead. And what I mean by that is like I see a lot of debates on LinkedIn about GTM engineering, which is actually making me think about not associating myself with that movement anymore, because people have their expertise and experiences, right? And they put that lens on this new term GTM engineering and are only able to wrap their head around parts of GTM engineering that they have some experience with, right? So, for example, a lot of people that have Clay knowledge will say, yeah, GTM engineering is doing outbound using Clay.
Mm-hmm.
Some RevOps people will say, yeah, GTM engineering is ignoring all the architecture and system thinking that RevOps is really good at and just breaking things and moving really fast. It's basically growth hacking 2.0, but just like wrapped in a new term.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Some salespeople will say, yeah, like I am a GTM engineer because I know how to use Clay or whatever, right? Like everyone has a different take on it, right? Because it's
Yeah.
like you said, the term, the role itself is very nascent. And because of that, there isn't sort of this consensus around the definition.
Yeah.
And I don't necessarily claim to have the definition for that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So again, very roundabout way to answer your question, but I would say that my understanding of what is required to be sort of this like AI enabled one person GTM wizard, I'm just gonna use that term just to differentiate from GTM engineer, which is very controversial.
Mm-hmm.
Clay is a great start for that. Is a good place to start,
Mm-hmm.
but I think there is so much more than what just you can do inside of Clay,
Mm-hmm.
that it's important that we understand what is possible if you look beyond Clay or just the use case of outbound. And I think Clay has been doing a good job of that as well, where they're starting to push content around like Clay isn't just about outbound. There's a lot of other things they can do with it as well.
GTM engineer also has the word engineer in it, which I think is a strength of. I mean, you did ops at Uber. You ran an ops community. I've seen a lot of the stuff that you posted on LinkedIn. I know that there's a lot going on there, and you clearly have mental models and skills around engineering that most people don't even know exist. Um, so you just explained that some people may not understand, or most people may not understand what's even possible. What are some things that are possibilities a lot of people don't consider when they're thinking of GTM engineering?
Go to market as a discipline is quite broad, right? And it comes in all shapes and sizes, right? It's like it could be a little bit of sales, it could be a little bit of customer success, marketing, and there's a lot of unstructured data, right? And so I can't say, oh, if you look beyond Clay or if you like start thinking outside, what you're used to, you'll be able to do X, Y, and Z. It's more about having the full set of tools at your disposal to be able to identify sort of a novel problem and say, oh, I think these concepts or these mental models or these approaches based on my experience and my knowledge make sense for this problem.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost like the way of problem solving, the way you think about problems and break them down. I would almost say that you should be sort of agnostic to the tool, because sometimes you don't necessarily want to just say, this is the one tool that I use for all problems, right?
Mm-hmm.
That rarely works out.
A carpenter or a plumber that only uses a hammer or a wrench is not probably very good at what they do.
Right, like what's the saying? Everything will look like a nail to someone who's holding a hammer or something
Yeah.
like that, right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah, exactly. Like, yeah, you could probably do some workarounds and some sort of like low code, no code gymnastics to like get to an outcome, but it'll be
Mm-hmm.
pretty shoddy and quite a fragile solution if you're not using the right tool for it.
Solving the right problem or the right strategy comes first, and then tools come second, or
Yeah, I think so.
at least they come after it.
Yeah.
How does one develop that mindset of choosing the right strategy, figuring out which is the right problem to solve, and then applying the right tools?
I think you have to have the right foundational knowledge and experience, right? Certain engineering concepts that um, you might not think about, right? But would be really handy. So, for example, thinking about um, like object-oriented programming, for example, right? Or like relational databases and how things in the physical world kind of relate to one another. Like a good use case in GTM being people versus companies, right?
Mhm.
Like how do you represent that relationship, right? And that actually has then implications on if you're using clay, like how do you design your or architect your clay table so that it accurately captures the one to many or many to many relationship that might exist between two different entities. Yeah, you should like brush up on programming 101. I think was it Stanford or Harvard that has like a CS50 like very intro course that
Mm.
goes through a lot of these concepts. And I'm not an engineer, by the way, right? Like I taught myself coding maybe like 2 3 years ago, and I've just been using it every day. So like I couldn't hack it together as a software engineer or even a software engineering intern at any company. Like, right? Let's put that disclaimer out there.
But in this space, you're definitely far ahead of the curve. I would say, based on what I've seen, you can build really nice systems.
It's because it's all relative,
It's all
right? Like
relative.
there
Yeah.
aren't right. Like yeah, I couldn't enter a room of like full of software engineers and like talk this nonsense. But it's all relative, and I think I forget the person who writes the Dilbert comics, but like they talk about how
Scott Adams.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And they talk about sort of like find that Venn diagram of like where you're top 25% in one area and then like your top 25% in the other area and the overlap, you'll actually find that you're in like top 10% or 5%, whatever it is, right? That
Right.
you don't have to be top 1% in just one area, but if you start overlapping different domains together and then like find the middle ground, then you'll actually find that you're relatively quite good at whatever you're doing because there aren't as many people that share those um, several experiences or domains that you bring to the table, right?
It's so true.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think that's what it is basically.
Lots and lots of developers and engineers, lots of salespeople and people who understand sales tactics. But the overlap there is very rare. I talk to people about, for example, hiring people for their company all the time, and there's just such a shortage of that skill stack right now.
Yeah, exactly. Like traditionally, I think they're very far apart, right?
Yeah,
But now, like with AI, what's been interesting is people are starting to apply more and more engineering concepts to sales, right? Like I think we've seen that happen with like revenue operations where you're kind of behind the scenes creating that architecture, right, and the system and the processes, but not sort of at the forefront actually interacting with your prospects or customers. But I think AI has sort of propelled that, and I think we've seen the same thing play out in like marketing, for example, right? Like performance marketing tends to be quite technical in terms of like the skill set they need to bring, right? And that evolved over time, and I think we'll start seeing more and more of this. I think in this space as well.
nice. Yeah, I saw Yash from Clay did a post about this a couple weeks ago, and he's talking about how, I don't know if he phrased it like this, but it's easier for someone to be a polymath because AI dramatically shrinks the time it takes for someone to become really good at multiple skills. So you can more easily get those influence skills or whatever sales skills, and also the even probably bridges the gap even faster, the technical side of things. But learning how to think, like having AI code for you and learning how to think like an engineer, I think are pretty different things. The thinking like an engineer's skill is something to me that's, if you don't have the skill, it's really hard to see it, but it's also really valuable in the right context.
Yeah, I think so. Especially when you're thinking about GTM engineering. Again, I don't want to get into the debate of defining it, but the fact of the matter is GTM tool landscape is very fragmented, right? And so a large responsibility of this supposed GTM engineer is to glue those together, to integrate those fragmented tools together to create something that is a little bit more coherent. And if that's the case, how you apply certain software engineering concepts to deliver that integration end-to-end workflow
Mm-hmm.
becomes really important, because that's going to make the difference between, do you have to come back and fix this like next week?
Yeah.
Or are you able to easily add on more integrations as your company grows?
Yeah. And if you look at, like, if you're building a doghouse, it doesn't matter if you're crappy at carpentry, but if you're building a cathedral, you have to do it right, or otherwise it's just going to keep falling apart. And so, like, yeah, it's, if you're hacking something together just for yourself or like as an experiment in the beginning, not having those skills is it's probably okay, and that's where you should start. When I first started being a developer, I thought I was great at what I was doing. And lucky for me, I got on a really big project. I built a SaaS from the ground up. I knew more than anyone else in the company, but I didn't know that much. And this, my boss gave me he paid me $7.50 an hour to essentially learn engineering while I was building. He gave me my lucky break, you could say. He's great, Christoph. And as the system grew, I saw how my hacky coding was causing monumental problems. And due to the pain of building a big system, I was forced to learn key engineering concepts. Like, I also didn't study as an engineer, but key engineering concepts like abstraction. It's all related. Abstraction, the dry principle, do not repeat yourself, and modular design. It was my brother, who's actually an engineer. He studied engineering, and he, at one point I was really good at, I was better than when I started, and I felt, oh, I'm really good now. I'm doing great. And he looked at the website that I'd written a year before that, and he said, I can tell I know way more about coding than you do just at looking at the website. I'm like, no, that's my old code. But but anyways, yeah, it's always something to learn. One thing that I seem to take away whenever I talk with you or interact with you or look at your LinkedIn posts is the fact that you're using engineering friendly tools. So I don't know how much controversy to cause. So if you have some training or experience in engineering or whatever, pulling systems together, you quickly start to notice that there are tools that are engineering friendly. They've been built by engineers for engineers, and those that had a different end user in mind. And just to give one example, is Calendly is great. It's a really good tool. I use it. It doesn't feel to me like it was built exactly for engineers. Whereas cal.com, which I've seen you use, I log in immediately. I'm like, yes, this makes my nerd brain happy. So I'm curious to know which tools, aside from the obvious ones, like we both use Clay. It's great. It may have some limitations around certain things that any growing tool would have, but what tools do you find yourself coming back to and over and over again for your projects?
I totally agree. There's like tools that you use where it's two things for me, like actually three things for me. It's the UX from sort of the hierarchy of information, as well as access to settings and the granularity of the settings
Mm-hmm.
that leaves it to the end user, that makes me feel really good. And I think engineering sort of minded tools give a ton of autonomy, but is also able to display that in a user-friendly way. And like you can just tell that someone's put a lot of thought into both the design and the engineering part of it.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is you also look at things like, does the tool itself enable you to use it like an engineer?
Mm-hmm.
I'll take Make as an example. I used to be a certified partner. I think I still am actually. An implementation partner for Make, which was back then called Integromat. And if you look at Integromat, and you see this on LinkedIn as well, where people will post their diagram of Integromat, and it's like a beast of an automation where there's like like limbs going everywhere and there's like 80 different nodes and it's like cramming up your whole LinkedIn screen.
Mhm.
And it looks really flashy and really cool, but anyone who likes, thinking in modular design way of thinking will look at that and be like, oh my gosh, that must be a nightmare to maintain because like how do you figure out what's going wrong or how do you update that system, right?
Right. You have to update it in 10 different places in order to fix one thing.
Exactly. So the natural solution to that would be, okay, well, maybe we kind of look, follow the sort of single responsibility principle, and we look at each like single responsibility, modularize that, and then bring that back into Make. But I don't think Make allows like,
It doesn't. I've tried to solve the same problem. It's been so frustrating. I thought I was just
right?
missing something, and no, it's yeah.
Yeah. So it's a great tool, but like when you start thinking about maintainability or optimization or improvement, it becomes really difficult because after you build that V1, you switch context, you work on another project, and you're like, oh, like I could actually improve this 80 node automation.
Mhm.
Like it becomes really, really difficult. Or even worse, if it starts causing bugs, how do you even debug that thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so an engineering minded software would probably give you the ability to modularize things, right? Like they would have that.
Mhm.
And a good example of that is AirOps, right? Like I've been using AirOps a lot. And there you can create a workflow, and inside a workflow, you can call another workflow, right?
Mhm.
And so you abstract all the steps that are in the workflow, in that child workflow, right? And all you need to do is like give it the right inputs, and it'll give you the outputs after running through that workflow.
Yeah.
But it's just very elegant in terms of the ability to carve out certain components that are used over and over again into their own modules, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's another sort of example of a tool that's really nice. And then Adio, it's like I use it all the time for my own business. It's funny because CRM is something that like not a lot of people love spending a lot of time in, but like Adio just is such a delight to just be in, and you can just feel like they have like these very subtle animations that are
Mm.
just like so spot on that behind the hood the engineering team had to put a lot of thought and effort into. And when you can see that it's not just like surface polish, but
Yeah.
it's like deeply integrated into the code, and you can just sort of see that snappiness in the interactions, right? Sorry, see, this is me geeking out over like
Please,
the
please
feel of
do.
software, right? But when you see that, you're like, oh, like I just want to spend so much time in it.
Yes.
So I've
I knew
probably
within
spent like
like a minute of being in audio that it's been
right,
incredible.
like
Yeah.
but you're still not using it for your
I'm
business, is
not.
that right?
Yeah. The
You
reason
should.
is
You should. Yeah.
if I had infinite time, I would. What I'm leaning more towards right now, I'm in a spreadsheet for some very specific reasons right now, but I would go with HubSpot. And the reason is you plug and play and you've got a lot out of the box. You can easily set up integrations where it's pulling in all your LinkedIn interactions. It's just doing so much automatically. There are a lot of integrations that I don't have to think about it. I can focus on other parts of my business. But as far as building incredible systems that are super flexible and do things that you couldn't probably dream of in HubSpot, or would be less elegant in HubSpot, audio is great, and it's I'm sure getting better pretty fast.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like they don't have a ton of the sort of off the shelf, out of box integrations. So it requires more building, which I'm like, that's great. Like I love doing that.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. Like for 80% of the use case, something like HubSpot probably makes a lot more sense because you can just, yeah, get these extensions, integrations. They're already built. You can just buy them from the marketplace, and it's plug and play.
Going back for a second to make.com, which I also use, and think it's a good gateway drug at the very least to AirOps or n8n, which I like. I've not played with AirOps personally, but n8n is the same. You can take something that's 80 nodes in Make, and it's probably 10 nodes or whatever in one of these tools like n8n or AirOps. Huge difference. Yeah. And that's just all those tools are visual, so it's easy to understand from that a visual way to understand the power of engineering, that engineering mindset. It makes things way less complex, way easier to maintain because it's easier to update 10 nodes or one node instead of 10 nodes. There's a whole world out there of building elegant systems that.
Yeah, and I would just say because I'm assuming a lot of people who will be watching this are using Clay and probably for the current main use case of outbound, right? If you're doing one-off things like outbound campaigns where you're experimenting with an offer with a target persona or whatever, right? You're setting that campaign up, seeing if it works, right? If it works, great. If it doesn't, then you move on to the next and so on and so forth. These like rapid iterations, you don't need to really worry about that, right? And I think
Yeah, yeah,
that's where sort of that ability to kind of think about engineering, but also balance that with sort of the pragmatic constraints of running sales is important. Where, yeah, if you just need to get 1,000 emails out really quickly, like don't worry about breaking this down into modules. Like use Clay, just like do it really quickly, right?
yeah,
But I think a tool like AirOps, for example, or n8n, when you start thinking about always on evergreen automations that have to reliably run every day, right, for the foreseeable future, and it's a core component of your business operation, then it's actually quite important that you start thinking about the right architecture for that process because the reliability, right, and the consistency of that workflow um, is going to dictate like how much time you have to work on other things in the
yeah.
business. So you want something that's quite robust and reliant or reliable.
That's a great point. Yeah, if you start building a bunch of evergreen things that break all the time, you're just going to be putting out fires all the time, and that really is a thing that happens with that causes otherwise great products to slow down to a halt. And I think Paul Graham, uh, YC founder, talks about the difference between, you know, I forget how he said it, but some startups would be as if they're piloting a single engine Cessna, and the other ones are going as if they're, Mach 3 and a advanced fighter pilot. Is the difference between good engineering and not good engineering, and that applies at like a like less sophisticated level in this space as well. Like design good systems and you can move a lot faster.
Your bias should be towards like practicing good hygiene, right? In terms of setting up the right architecture and system. But there will be times when sort of business priorities dictate that you be a bit more pragmatic, right? Or be quicker in doing things, right? In which case then it's on you to kind of make that trade-off and be like, I'm okay with not modularizing this or whatever because I don't even know if this is actually going to be a full-time thing, right? And so again, like that GTM engineer, right? The ability to sort of think through these trade-offs because they know what good looks like on both sides, right?
Yes.
And think
Yeah.
about the ramifications and the implications of certain design choices and being able to like come to a good decision every time I think is also important. But like none of that is really, it's not like you can learn a tool and like learn all of that, right? Like you actually have to like suffer a little bit from like poorly designed, like poorly coded
Yeah.
solutions and
Yeah.
design solutions. Like you have to have that lived experience to know sort of like what you're gonna see down the road. Um, so yeah, it's I don't think it's like you snap a finger or like you learn one tool and then you become a GTM engineer.
I totally agree. Experience, preferably suffering at your own hand, so you can actually learn the lesson instead of just complaining. And yeah, making that trade off is another invisible skill that is hard to learn. Like I, for example, tend to over engineer things. Um, Other people tend to be more cowboys. Yeah. Anyways, it's cowboys or cowgirls. Yeah. So do you have a hard stop? Do you have 5 minutes?
No, I don't. Yeah, let's go over. I'm enjoying this.
Awesome, same. I was hoping you could show us a small example, perhaps, of how you're using engineering concepts, um, and engineering thinking for your work.
Yes, I won't be able to show you the whole thing, but I'll show you like a small part of it, and I'll show Clay because I think this is probably the most relevant for the audience. And it's basically a concept of modularizing your workflows, right? And so I will share my screen in a little bit, but just to set the stage, what happens when you start working across multiple clients is that you're going to have certain enrichments or certain workflows that you run over and over and over again, right? So taking that sort of do not repeat yourself principle, modularization, right? Um, Taking those concepts, what you want to do is actually carve out that workflow into its own function, right? That takes inputs and generates an output, right? Instead of having to
Like a black box for you.
yeah. So I guess what I'm saying is, let's actually take just an example, and I can show it to you what it looks like,
Okay.
right? For example, if you're running outbound for 10 different clients, right? And your go-to play for the third email in any email sequences, you like to reference the recipient coworker, right? So I might say,
Hmm.
hey, Nathan, it seems like this is not a top priority for you after having sent a couple of emails to you.
Hmm.
Would Flory Reyes be the right person for this, what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
By doing that, I think this was originally Eric Nowoslawski's tactic, right? Like you mention their colleagues so that you show them that like you understand the business or like you understand the team dynamics, right?
Yeah.
And so you might pull in that person's full name. Anyways, if you're doing this in a lot of different campaigns, you don't necessarily want to pull the colleague's name and then clean it up because, as you know, with names, oftentimes it's going to have titles, right? Like doctor or PhD, MBA, MD, whatever it is, right?
Or an emoji.
Or it might or an emoji. It might be all in all caps, right? It might have the preferred name in parentheses, right? It might have like a maiden name somewhere. Like there's a lot of different flavors, right? Depending on which country you're talking about, which language you're talking about. So what you want to actually do is instead of creating this cleanup function, full name cleanup function in every table that you build inside of Clay, you actually want to carve it out into its own separate table
Hmm.
where you can just feed it the input parameters of like, here's the full name, right? And you might give it, here's the email in case email gives you some other clues, right? And then just get LLM, get an AI model to clean that up and then give you back the cleaned full name with maybe its confidence level.
Yes. So let's say that you have this in 100 different clay tables. You want to do this in 100 different clay tables. You have to write it. You write this module once, and then let's say that all your 100 tables are hey, asking this module, hey, can you clean this name? And then you discover that some of the names are coming back and something's missing, and you need to update the prompt. And so instead of updating it in 100 different tables, you just make a tweak to one prompt, and then you just saved yourself hours of work and headache and distraction. And yeah, and in reality, if you have 100, you're gonna, when you go to update them, you're gonna miss some of them, and it just causes a whole explosion of mess. I see the value of this.
That's exactly right. Thank you for bringing that up. It's not so much that you have to set it up once because yeah, like the initial setup might take you just as much time, but it's the maintenance, right? And the continuous improvement that becomes really difficult if you create clones or instances of the same function across multiple clay tables, right? If you just have it in one, then yeah, whenever you find an edge case of like, oh, like this doesn't filter out maiden names, for example, right? Then you can update the prompt in that one function versus 100 instances of the same function. So
Awesome. I love the example. Do you have an example of this?
yeah. So let me show you the clay table for that. Okay, so this is my functions table, right? So if I just show you the overview, there's a bunch of different functions that I've built that I just run for things that I do all the time, right? Like cleaning company name, right? Clean first name, clean job title, clean full name, searching on Serper, looking up email host, um, finding company's LinkedIn URL from the company's URL, I think. I do that through Google search, and then validating with Bounce Band, which is one of the validation providers that I use to validate an email. I'll just focus on one use case, which is clean full name, because I think it captures everything that I want to show. Oh, by the way, quick pro tip is I've appended f dot in front of every one of them, because when you type that in, then it'll bring up all the functions when you go search for it in other tables, right? So it makes it a little bit easier for you
It's a
to
great
find all
convention.
of your
That's cool.
functions by naming, by having that convention. Yep. Um, super nerdy, but it's important. And then we have more conventions here where I is the input, right? So if you think about cleaning a full name as a function, then one of the inputs that you need to give it is a full name, right? And then the O in parentheses here is optional. So, and the reason for that is sometimes, depending on the data source that you work with, you might get first name and last name and no full name, right? So I made that optional. Same thing with first name and last name. And I also give it email in case we might not have like a first name or a last name or even full name, but the email might have the full name in there, right? And then the person's LinkedIn URL as well, because sometimes their LinkedIn handle might tell you what their full name is, right? Um, and then this is the crux of the function, right? Which is just an LLM prompt that basically says, here are the variables, right? I'm going to give you the full name, first name, last name, email, LinkedIn URL. And you can see that I've used 1337 tokens. So it's a pretty long prompt just to clean a full name, right?
That stands
And
for LEET in Haxor language or whatever. 1337. Have you seen that?
no, I have
LEET.
not.
It used to be a way
Leet.
to
Yeah.
say elite in ways that I don't know. I don't know the origin, but that's a very
Is that where like
meaningful
leet coding
hacker
comes
number.
from? Leet
Yeah,
code?
I think so.
Nice,
Yeah,
nice.
yeah.
What a
Anyways,
coincidence.
sorry.
Freaking
Yeah.
stars
So
aligned for us to really nerd out here. Um, right. So 1337 tokens of um, LLM copy, basically, right? That gives all of these instructions of like, and these were developed over time, right? Like as I found the edge cases, to your point, and across different tables, I started inserting more and more instructions, right? Handle preferred names, handle maiden names, handle initials, remove pronouns, handle multi-part names, special character cleaning, blah, blah. And then I also tell it what I want for the JSON output, right? And then, so then what you get is the output, which is the confidence level, right? So I might want to look at this confidence level and handle the name a little bit differently in my campaign if it's less than high, right? I might write certain logic to handle that. But if it's high, then I want the clean first name, which is again output. So the O's for output, clean last name, and then clean full name, right? So it's super simple. And what I do is every time I need to clean a name, I use the write to table function in Clay to insert a new row here, right? Oh, this is a good example. Sorry, I off topic, but like you can see that first name here, according to this data source, is doctor, right? But after it goes through it, it cleans it correctly and says it's Crystal Walker instead of right, Dr. Crystal Walker, CPTM, SHR, blah 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 blah, right? Um, so yeah, I use the write to table, create a row in here, and then I look it up in this table again, and then I just feed it one of the variables, like the full name, to match a row that equals this, right? And then I'm able to get all of this in the JSON output in that lookup, right? And then I also have dedupe turned on so that we don't waste credits on names that we already have, right? Uh, Something like, I don't know, like Joe Smith might come up again and again and again, for example, because it's a common name. That way we don't have to waste credits because we've already run this, and names are static. They're not going to change. So we can just reuse the clean name if we've run that name already, although the chances of that happening are kind of low. Cool. Yeah. So yeah, it's a super simple example, right? But like if you have more than, I don't know, 5 clients or even 3 clients, let's say, and you're constantly creating new campaigns that require full names, right? Like that's just going to save you a ton of time in your campaign
totally.
setup, right? Now, the caveat here, because of the way Clay is built, is that um, when you write to table from your campaign table to that function table to clean the full name, right? And then you look it up, it's actually hard to insert a delay in between the write to table and lookup. But when you write to table, you have to call the LLM, get the result back, and then you can look it up. But sometimes there will be an instance where you try to look it up before the clean full name is ready, has been generated by the LLM. So there's a couple ways of doing this. One is to insert an intermediary step between writing to table and looking up to introduce a delay. Clay doesn't have a native delay function or delay enrichment column, but you can
Alert to
use
Clay.
Postman.
Let's. Oh,
Sorry?
I'm just saying feedback for Clay. Please add that.
Yeah, please add delays and scheduled runs, right? But you can use, for the time being, Postman. I think it's postman-echo.com/delay
Nice.
/10.
Okay.
And then what it does is it's basically an API call that you can make to Postman, and Postman's going to wait 10 seconds and then give you a response. So you get to insert that 10-second delay in between, which is usually enough time for like a simple LLM call like that to
Yep.
Initiate and then finish, right? Or you might want to actually set up like a paid service. There are a bunch out there where you can introduce a delay that's over 10 seconds if needed. But just a pro tip, inside of Clay, any API call needs to initiate and finish within 120 seconds. And by my experiment, based on my experiments, it's actually more like 110 seconds. So any long-standing sort of API calls that are really long won't work. So
You have to use a
just
different
FYI.
design pattern inside Clay, which with callback URLs.
That's correct, exactly. So you would have to do either webhook, right, and then do like polling or whatever it is to like asynchronously retrieve back the result after the result has become available.
I just want to note for the listeners that if you're lost, that's normal. It's probably hard to understand what we're talking about if you don't have the background yet. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with you at all. To revisit the name function very briefly for a second before we finish. So you're sending a request from one Clay table to the other table by writing a row to it. And then you may have another row that waits for 10 seconds or whatever.
Column that waits a
column, what I meant. Yeah, sorry. A column. So this is using a custom API call to, you said Postman something delay. And then after you waited 10 seconds, you're checking that table again to say, hey, do you have that name that I asked you for? Yep, the name, unless there's been a delay or an error in processing it, there's going to be that row with the same name that you inserted in previously. You look it up and say, here are the cells or columns that have the clean name in it. Here's my clean name. I'm happy. Thank goodness I didn't have to write that for 100 different tables.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'll just add one more thing, which is that in engineering and in life and in work and in everything, there's rarely an absolutely correct answer. Everything is a set of trade-offs that you need to make, right? And as an agency owner or an expert, right, people are almost paying you not for the work that you do, but like the right set of trade-offs that you're making all the time, right? All that to say, this design pattern of creating a function table, right, might not necessarily be the right set of trade-offs to make because you do have to create that write to table, call an API to wait 10 seconds, then look it up. And if it's still not ready, then you're going to have to run those rows again, right? So I could see in the comments people being like, that's really like a lot of work for like what? Like just so that you can carve out that function, right? So it depends on the business context in which you're running this, right? The fact that I don't have to copy and paste the same LLM prompt, and it's a lot easier for me to improve upon that one LLM prompt instead of having to track down 100 different use cases of it, right? So that all of my clients benefit from this improvement in LLM trumps some of the other trade-off considerations like having to set up those three enrichment columns to basically write to table, call an API to wait, and then look it up. So it really depends. Like I'm not going to say this is absolutely how everyone should do it, because it isn't, not all the time.
Yeah, this particular problem has several different solutions. One is the copy and paste. One is the way that you're mentioning. Another is to call make.com and have that handled in a single cell in Clay. But trade-offs in each circumstance that
Yeah, make is a good shout. You could definitely do that to make AirOps or whatever, but then you don't get the benefit of like this database function of like looking up to see if a name already exists, right? Unless you like build a database on top of it as well.
we built it in Make actually before, but yeah, it's a big mess to set that sort of thing up. I think that's a topic for another podcast or podcast. But
Like your head spinning to like trying to think about all the trade-offs. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
well, this has been really. I think that people are going to get a lot of value from this, Joe. So thank you so much for coming and talking. I imagine there will be a lot of questions after people watch as well. So just thank you so much. Really insightful.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation, as I always do. And yeah, if people need to reach out to ask any questions about the workflow company or the Clay function concept that we went through today, or anything else, you can find me on LinkedIn.